June 1942, Dieppe, France. The morning fog lifted slowly over the Channel beaches, revealing a silhouette that made German gunners pause, a shape that defied everything they knew about British armor. Low, broad, impossibly slow, yet advancing through obstacles that should have stopped it cold. The Churchill tank had arrived, and with it came a problem German doctrine had not anticipated. A machine built not for speed or elegance, but for something far more terrifying: absolute, relentless persistence. They had studied British tanks before. The Matilda had proven tough but limited, the Crusader fast but fragile. This new arrival seemed to violate the very principles of armored warfare. It crawled at walking pace, presented a massive target, carried a gun that seemed almost apologetic. German intelligence officers wrote dismissive reports. Panzer commanders allowed themselves brief moments of relief. Here was proof, they believed, that British engineering had finally exhausted itself in desperation. What they could not see, what would take 2 years of brutal combat to reveal, was that they were facing not a failure of British imagination, but a deliberate rejection of German assumptions about what tanks were meant to do. The Churchill emerged from a crisis of doctrine. After Dunkirk, Britain possessed neither the luxury of time nor the illusion of invincibility. Tank production had become a matter of national survival, but the debate over what to build consumed precious months. Should they copy German designs, fast, aggressive, built for breakthrough? Or should they acknowledge a harder truth, that Britain would fight this war not with blitzkrieg, but with grinding persistence through terrain where speed meant nothing and endurance meant everything? Vauxhall Motors received specifications that seemed almost suicidal. Build a tank capable of crossing trenches wider than anything seen in the Great War. Make it climb slopes no existing vehicle could manage. Armor it heavily enough to survive direct hits. And do it all with an engine originally designed for buses, because that was what Britain had available. The result weighed 39 tons and moved at 15 miles per hour on flat ground, slower than a running man over rough terrain. German intelligence evaluated the first captured examples with something approaching pity. The armor was thick, yes, 102 millimeters at the front, but the 2-pounder gun was already obsolete, ineffective against modern German armor. The suspension used 11 small road wheels per side, an engineering choice that screamed over complexity and maintenance nightmares. The tank sat high off the ground, presenting an enormous target. Most damning of all, it was slow, painfully, almost comically slow by the standards of panzer warfare. What the reports did not capture, what could not be captured in measurements and specifications, was the philosophical divide this machine represented. German tanks were designed for a war of movement, for the devastating punch and rapid exploitation that had conquered Poland and France. The Churchill was designed for a different kind of war entirely. The slow, methodical reduction of fortified positions, the patient advance through rubble and wire, the kind of fighting where survival mattered more than speed, and where the ability to keep moving, to simply refuse to stop, could matter more than the ability to kill. In Berlin, the reports were filed with minimal concern. The Eastern Front dominated planning. The Churchill seemed a footnote, one more example of British industrial desperation producing quantity over quality. Dieppe changed everything, though the full implications took months to understand. On August 19, 1942, Canadian forces assaulted the French port with Churchill tanks in support, the first time the new design would face German defenders in force. The operation became a catastrophe. Of 29 Churchills that landed, not one made it off the beach operational. German observers watching from pillboxes saw exactly what they expected: slow, cumbersome targets that bogged down on shingle, sitting ducks for concealed anti-tank guns. But something in those reports troubled the more thoughtful German commanders. The Churchills had not simply died. They had taken extraordinary punishment before succumbing. Direct hits from 50mm guns that should have penetrated failed to do so. Tanks that threw tracks under fire continued fighting as static pillboxes. Several machines absorbed a dozen hits or more before falling silent. Most disturbing of all, the few Churchills that reached the seawall climbed it, negotiated a vertical obstacle that should have been absolutely impassable. Captain Hans Weber, commanding a 50mm anti-tank gun at Dieppe, wrote in his diary that night, "We stopped them, but it took everything we had. The British tank moves like a tortoise, but its shell is almost impenetrable to our standard weapons. If they learn to use it properly, if they bring it to terrain where speed does not matter." He did not finish the thought. The British learned. Diepp's lessons were brutal but clear. The Churchill's weaknesses, speed, firepower, were fatal in open beach assaults. Its strengths, armor, climbing ability, mechanical reliability, meant nothing if you used it like a cavalry charge. What the Churchill needed was not a beach. It needed mountains, ruins, fortifications, terrain where German mobility advantages disappeared and British stubbornness became a virtue. Tunisia would provide exactly that terrain. By November 1942, Churchills were shipping to North Africa, not for desert sweeps where Rommel's panzers could maneuver freely, but for the Tunisian mountains, steep, rocky, roadless terrain where speed meant nothing, and the ability to simply climb forward, taking punishment and returning fire, meant everything. German commanders began receiving reports of a different nature. The tone had changed. Words like stubborn, difficult, and most ominously, effective began appearing. April 1943. Longstop Hill, Tunisia. The position dominated the approach to Tunis, a rocky prominence honeycombed with German defensive works. Considered by Axis commanders to be effectively tank-proof, the slopes were too steep, the terrain too broken. Infantry could assault it, certainly, but armor would have to wait in the valleys below, providing what fire support it could from disadvantageous positions. The Churchill crews thought differently. At dawn on April 22nd, a squadron began the climb. Not a rapid assault, but a methodical advance using the tank's unique suspension to maintain stability on slopes that averaged 35 degrees and in places exceeded 40. German defenders initially held fire, assuming the British would recognize the impossibility and withdraw. When the Churchills continued climbing, confusion gave way to frantic urgency. The first anti-tank rounds struck at 700 meters, hitting frontal armor at oblique angles. The Churchills absorbed the impacts and kept climbing. Panzerfaust teams tried to position themselves for flank shots, but the British infantry following the tanks suppressed them. Most critically, the German guns were positioned to fire along likely approach routes, and those routes did not include the near-vertical faces the Churchills were now ascending. Oberleutnant Karl Fischer, commanding the hilltop defense, radioed back in language that reflected his disbelief. British heavy tanks climbing the north face. Repeat. Climbing, not approaching. Angles impossible for any known armor. Request immediate artillery support. The artillery came, but adjusting fire onto slopes where the Churchills moved at walking pace proved maddeningly difficult. Rounds that fell short simply rolled back down. Rounds that overshot were wasted. The Churchills continued upward. What German observers noted with particular alarm was the mechanical reliability. These were not fresh tanks on a proving ground. They had been in continuous operation for weeks, moving through terrain that should have shattered suspensions and transmissions. Yet here they were, performing feats of engineering that seemed to violate basic principles of mobility and stress tolerance. One Churchill threw a track near the summit, bogged under artillery fire. Its crew stayed inside, continuing to fire the main gun and machine guns until British infantry could reach the position 6 hours later. When the crew finally emerged, they had expended every round of ammunition and claimed 3 confirmed anti-tank gun kills from their immobile position. Longstop Hill fell. The reports reaching German headquarters in Tunis carried a new tone, not contempt, but grudging respect mixed with concern. The psychological impact rippled through German defensive planning faster than official tactical revisions. Junior officers who had faced Churchills began making unauthorized modifications to anti-tank positions, digging them deeper, angling fields of fire to catch the British tanks on the climb, rather than at the crest, stockpiling additional armor-piercing ammunition. The changes were subtle but telling. German defenders were now planning specifically for an opponent they had dismissed 6 months earlier. Panzer commanders faced a more nuanced problem. In open terrain, their Tigers and Panthers remained superior in every measurable category: speed, firepower, armor design. But the war was not being fought exclusively in open terrain. Italy loomed, a peninsula of mountains, rivers, and medieval towns where German mobile advantages would shrink and British methodical persistence would shine. The Churchill's weaknesses in the desert became irrelevant in the Apennines. Its strengths, the ones German doctrine had never valued, suddenly looked prescient. Private testimonies began appearing in letters home, in diary entries censors did not always catch. Wehrmacht veterans wrote about British tanks that refused to die, that came through fire that should have melted them, that climbed walls we thought protected us. The language was not panicked, but it carried an undercurrent of frustration. German soldiers had been trained to respect certain enemies. Soviet T-34s for their numbers and crude effectiveness, American Shermans for their reliability and abundance. The Churchill demanded respect for different reasons, not because it could kill you quickly, but because it could survive everything you threw at it and keep coming. The British noticed the change. Intelligence reports documented increased German nervousness when Churchills appeared, a tendency to fire earlier and more often, wasting ammunition on a tank whose armor could handle the abuse. More significantly, German forces began avoiding certain types of terrain when they knew Churchills were in the area. The British had inadvertently created a kind of psychological area denial weapon, not through fear of its killing power, but through fear of fighting it in conditions where it could not be stopped. In Rome, Kesselring reviewed the Tunisian after-action reports with mounting concern. Italy would be worse, far worse. Every mountain, every river crossing, every fortified town would be Churchill country. The weapon the Germans had dismissed as a desperate improvisation was about to fight on terrain perfectly suited to its strange combination of capabilities. The engineering intelligence war intensified. German technical teams received orders to capture intact Churchills for detailed analysis. What they found troubled them more than battlefield performance alone could explain. The tank's design philosophy was alien to German thinking, almost Soviet in its acceptance of certain limitations in exchange for overwhelming advantages in narrow categories. The suspension system particularly fascinated German engineers. 11 small road wheels per side, each independently sprung, a maintenance nightmare that should have been a fatal design flaw. Yet in practice, the system distributed weight so effectively that the Churchill could cross soft ground that swallowed German tanks. More importantly, those small wheels and tight suspension travel meant the tank's hull remained nearly level even on extreme slopes. A Tiger on a 30-degree incline was a partially disabled Tiger, its turret traverse limited, its gun depression inadequate. A Churchill on the same slope operated normally. The armor scheme proved equally alien. German tanks used sloped armor to maximize effective thickness. Elegant, efficient, proven. The Churchill used thick vertical plates, crude by German standards, yet effective through sheer mass. What German metallurgists noticed was the quality. British armor plate was proving more resistant to spalling and cracking than German intelligence had assumed. Hits that would have sent lethal fragments through the crew compartment of other tanks left Churchill interiors relatively intact. Crews survived hits that should have killed them, and surviving crews kept fighting. Most concerning was the production data. Germany's armor industry was a marvel of precision engineering, but precision took time. Britain was producing Churchills at a rate that suggested they had sacrificed elegance for output. Yet the tanks reaching the field were not disposable mob units. They were tough, reliable machines that required surprisingly little maintenance. Captured maintenance logs showed Churchills operating for weeks without major breakdowns, something even Germany's own panzers struggled to match in Italian conditions. The British had stumbled onto something German planning had not anticipated. A tank optimized not for the war Germany wanted to fight, but for the war Germany was actually having to fight. The Blitzkrieg was over. The Eastern Front was stabilizing into grinding attrition. Italy was mountain warfare, where every advantage German panzers possessed in open terrain vanished into narrow defiles and vertical hillsides. And in those conditions, the slow, tough, endlessly persistent Churchill was not just competitive, it was, increasingly, superior. Monte Cassino, January 1944. The monastery dominated the Liri Valley, its position considered by German commanders to be the strongest natural defensive line in Italy. Kesselring's forces had 6 months to fortify it, creating defensive works that leveraged every advantage of terrain and modern military engineering. Allied planners looked at the approaches and saw a nightmare. Open killing grounds covered by interlocking fields of fire, river crossings under direct observation, slopes too steep for conventional armor. The Churchill crews saw opportunity. Not for breakthrough, that was never the Churchill's purpose, but for sustained, methodical reduction of positions that could not be flanked or bypassed. Over 4 months, through 4 separate offensives, Churchills ground forward through conditions that would have stopped any other Allied tank. They crossed rivers using fascines, bundles of wood they carried specifically for bridging obstacles. They negotiated rubble fields where destroyed buildings had been deliberately collapsed to create tank barriers. Most impressively, they climbed slopes under direct fire, providing mobile fortifications for infantry who would have been pinned down without them. German defenders discovered something demoralizing. You could hit a Churchill a dozen times and only slow it down. The tank's armor could not be penetrated reliably by anything short of an 88mm gun at close range, and 88mm guns were in desperately short supply, needed for air defense and anti-armor screens on more critical fronts. The standard 75mm anti-tank guns that were the backbone of German defensive lines simply bounced rounds off Churchill glacis plates. Hitting the tracks was possible, but even a D-track Churchill became a pillbox. Its gun still functional, its crew still fighting. The psychological mathematics shifted. German infantry learned to fear the Churchill not because it would kill them. Any tank could kill infantry, but because it represented inevitability. When Churchills appeared, it meant the British were committed to taking the position regardless of cost. It meant the battle would be slow, grinding, and ultimately lost. Panzer Grenadiers began requesting transfers away from sectors where Churchill activity was heavy. The requests were usually denied, but the pattern was noted in personnel reports. What made it worse was the contrast with American Shermans. The Sherman was faster, lighter, easier to kill. A tank German veterans had learned to respect but not fear. But where Shermans appeared, tactical withdrawals remained possible. Where Churchills appeared, you held or died, because withdrawal under fire from an enemy who never stopped coming was nearly impossible. The Churchill evolved, and each evolution narrowed German tactical options further. The Mark 7 variant appeared in late 1944, carrying a 75mm gun that finally gave the tank offensive firepower to match its defensive qualities. German intelligence reports noted the upgrade with alarm. The one weakness they could exploit reliably was disappearing. A Churchill 7 was not just hard to kill, it could now kill effectively in return. More concerning was the Churchill Avro, armored vehicle Royal Engineers. Armed with a 209mm petard mortar, firing a 40-pound demolition charge, the Avery turned the Churchill from a tank into a mobile siege engine. German bunkers that could withstand conventional tank fire disintegrated under petard impacts. Coastal fortifications constructed to withstand naval bombardment crumbled after 3 or 4 hits. The Germans had built the Atlantic Wall assuming certain weapons would never appear on a battlefield. The AVRE proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. Normandy revealed the full implications. On D-Day +1, Churchills began appearing in roles German defenders had not prepared for. Churchill crocodiles, flamethrower variants, cleared bunkers that had survived the naval bombardment. Churchill bridge layers spanned anti-tank ditches in minutes. Churchill Avries demolished strongpoints from ranges where German defenders could not effectively return fire. Most devastatingly, standard gun Churchills simply absorbed the defensive fire German positions could deliver, allowing Allied infantry to advance behind them. The Battle of Hill 112 in June 1944 demonstrated the evolved Churchill's capabilities in miniature. For 3 weeks, German and British forces fought for a hill that controlled approaches to Caen. The fighting reduced the hill to a moonscape. Every tree destroyed, every building flattened, the ground torn by artillery and churned by tanks. In that apocalyptic terrain, Churchills operated when other tanks could not. Their low ground pressure and excellent suspension let them traverse ground where Shermans bogged and Tigers struggled. Their armor let them survive in killing zones where lighter vehicles were destroyed. Their mechanical reliability meant they kept operating in conditions that would have broken down more sophisticated machines. A Tiger could kill a Churchill in open combat, but there was no open combat on Hill 112. There was only close-range grinding through rubble, and in those conditions the Churchill's advantages overwhelmed the Tiger's superior gun and speed. German commanders realized with growing horror that they had built an army for mobile warfare in a war that was no longer mobile. The convergence of British infantry tactics with Churchill capabilities created a combined arms system German doctrine struggled to counter. British infantry had learned to use the Churchill not as a breakthrough weapon, but as mobile cover, advancing in its shadow, using its bulk to shield them from fire, trusting its armor to absorb the hits that would kill them. The Churchill's slow speed, once seen as a crippling weakness, became an asset. Infantry could keep pace with the tank, maintaining the protective envelope throughout the advance. German defensive planning had assumed certain constants. Tanks would race ahead of infantry, creating exploitation opportunities. Tanks could be separated from their supporting infantry with artillery fire. Tanks would break down, run out of fuel, or withdraw for resupply, creating windows for counterattack. The Churchill violated all these assumptions. It moved with its infantry at infantry pace. It operated in conditions where artillery was as much a danger to the firer as the target. It kept running when everything else stopped. Allied intelligence officers began documenting German tactical changes that revealed the impact. Wehrmacht units facing Churchill-equipped British divisions received specific instructions. Engage at maximum range. Fall back rather than attempting to hold positions the Churchill could climb to. Conserve 80mm ammunition for confirmed Churchill targets. Avoid close-range combat where the British tank's armor was effectively impenetrable. These were not the tactics of an army confident in its anti-tank capabilities. These were desperate expedients from defenders who had learned through blood that their standard weapons no longer worked. The human element deepened German concerns. Churchill crews developed reputations for near-suicidal persistence. Tanks that took catastrophic damage often kept fighting. Crews that should have bailed out stayed in burning vehicles to cover infantry advances. The British had somehow created not just a tough tank, but a culture of toughness around it. A belief among crews that their armor would save them, and that belief becoming self-fulfilling as they took risks no rational tank commander should take. General Lieutenant Heinrich Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group West in Normandy, wrote in his diary, "The British Churchill is not the best tank on the battlefield, but it may be the most difficult to defeat, because it renders so many of our advantages irrelevant. We cannot outmaneuver it in the terrain where we fight it. We cannot reliably kill it with the weapons our infantry carry, and we cannot ignore it, because it will simply continue forward until it overruns our positions." As the Allied advance drove toward Germany itself, the Churchill's role evolved one final time. The tank that had proven itself in mountains and rubble now faced the Rhine fortifications, the Siegfried Line, and the final desperate German defenses. Here, the Churchill's siege warfare capabilities would be tested against the most heavily fortified positions in Europe. British planners knew the Siegfried Line intimately. They had helped design its predecessor in World War I. The Germans had learned from that war's lessons, creating defensive works specifically designed to resist the weapons that had broken the earlier fortifications. Dragon's teeth anti-tank barriers, interlocking bunkers with overlapping fields of fire, pre-sighted artillery zones, all calculated to stop the kind of armor the Allies possessed. But the calculations had not accounted for the Churchill AVRE and its 290mm petard. German engineers examining captured AVRE demolition charges realized with sinking certainty that their bunkers were vulnerable. The petard's 40-pound projectile carried enough explosive to collapse concrete structures that could withstand 500-pound bombs. The AVRE's armor meant it could approach positions under fire that would destroy other vehicles. Most critically, the Churchill's climbing ability meant it could attack bunkers from angles the designers had assumed were impossible to reach. Preparation for the Rhine crossing revealed the full evolution of Churchill tactics. Specialized variants, bridge layers, fascine carriers, crocodile flamethrowers, standard gun tanks, would operate in coordinated teams, each variant covering the other's weaknesses. The Churchill had become not just a tank but a complete assault system, evolved through 3 years of combat into something German defensive doctrine had no answer for. Wehrmacht officers briefed on the expected assault characteristics spoke privately about the British monster, not a single tank, but the entire Churchill concept, the combination of armor, persistence, specialized variants, and tactical doctrine that treated breakthrough not as a rapid exploitation, but as methodical reduction. The Wehrmacht had spent the war learning to defeat fast, aggressive armor. They had never learned to defeat armor that simply endured. The crossing itself, when it came in March 1945, confirmed German fears. Churchills led the assault, AVREs destroying bunkers, bridge layers spanning ditches, crocodiles clearing trenches, standard tanks suppressing counterattacks. The fortifications held briefly, but briefly against a Churchill assault meant hours, not days. Once the British established a position, once they brought Churchills across the river, German commanders knew the position would expand inexorably until it became a breakthrough. The final German defensive lines in the Ruhr demonstrated what happened when Wehrmacht forces faced Churchill-led assaults without adequate anti-armor support. The Tiger and Panther units that might have provided an effective counter were destroyed or committed elsewhere. fighting the Soviets in the east, dying in the Ardennes counteroffensive, pulled back to defend Berlin. What remained were garrison units, Volkssturm militia, and scratch formations with minimal heavy weapons. Against these forces, the Churchill became nearly invincible. British columns advanced at the pace of infantry, 3 or 4 miles per day, but they advanced every single day without pause. German strongpoints that could have held for weeks against conventional assault fell in hours once AVREs appeared. The 209 Petard demolished bunkers, bridges, roadblocks, anything that might slow the British advance. Behind the AVREs, standard Churchills provided fire support and absorbed any counterfire German defenders could muster. Oberst Walter Reinhardt, commanding a Kampfgruppe near Münster, described the experience in a report that reached OKW headquarters in early April. The British do not attack. They simply arrive, slowly and inevitably. Their Churchill tanks take up positions where we cannot effectively engage them. Their AVREs destroy our strongpoints from ranges where our Panzerfausts cannot reach. When we attempt to counterattack, their armor is too thick for our remaining anti-tank weapons. We delay them for hours, perhaps a day. Then we retreat because there is no other option. We are not being defeated. We are being ground down. The grinding was systematic. British tactics had evolved to exploit every Churchill advantage while minimizing its weaknesses. They advanced in terrain where speed didn't matter, through towns, forests, broken ground. They used AVREs to clear obstacles rather than attempting to bypass them. They never advanced faster than their supply lines could support, which meant Churchills never ran out of ammunition or fuel at critical moments. The tactics were unspectacular, methodical, almost boring in their predictability. They were also nearly unstoppable. German soldiers began surrendering when they saw Churchills approaching, not from cowardice. Many were veterans who had fought in Russia, Normandy, the Ardennes. They surrendered because they recognized futility. You could damage a Churchill, slow it down, force it to stop and repair, but you could not destroy it with the weapons infantry carried, and you could not escape it once it started moving toward your position. Surrender was not defeat. It was basic survival mathematics. The war's final weeks brought a peculiar inversion. German forces that had once hunted Allied armor now actively avoided contact with Churchill-equipped units. Intelligence reports documented Wehrmacht units taking longer routes, abandoning better positions, accepting tactical disadvantages, anything to avoid fighting British tank units they could no longer defeat. The psychological victory was complete. The Churchill had become something more than a weapon system. It had become a symbol of inevitable defeat. When German defenders saw its distinctive low silhouette approaching, they knew the battle's outcome. Questions remained only about timing and casualties. Would they hold for a day or a week? Would they withdraw in order or die in the rubble? But the final outcome was never in doubt. What made this psychological dominance remarkable was that it derived not from the Churchill's killing power, but from its unkillability. German soldiers had faced more dangerous tanks, Soviet IS-2s that could penetrate any armor at range, American Pershings with superior guns. But those tanks could be stopped by skilled anti-tank crews with adequate preparation. The Churchill could not be reliably stopped by anything short of an 88mm gun, and 88mm guns no longer existed in the numbers needed. British tank crews, sensing this shift, grew bolder. Churchill commanders took risks that would have been suicidal in 1943, advancing across open ground, engaging superior numbers, operating without infantry support in situations where tactical doctrine said they should withdraw. Increasingly, German forces simply retreated rather than engaging. The Churchill had achieved what no other Allied tank managed. It had made German soldiers believe that resistance was pointless. Lieutenant Klaus Weber, captured near Hamburg in late April 1945, spoke for many when interrogators asked about the Churchill. We called it the English tortoise. Very slow, very old-fashioned, with a weak gun and strange design, but it would not die. You could hit it again and again, waste all your Panzerfaust rounds, watch them bounce off or barely dent the armor, and it would keep coming, firing, protecting the British infantry. After a while, you stopped trying to kill it and just tried to stay alive until it passed. That was surrender in stages. First your weapons failed, then your tactics failed, then your courage failed. The British tortoise taught us that we had already lost. The tortoise had outlasted everything Germany could throw at it, and in outlasting, it had conquered. April 28, 1945, north of Bremen. The war had 6 days left. though the men fighting did not know it yet. A battalion of Volkssturm militia, old men and boys armed with Panzerfausts in desperation, held a village that British planners needed as an artillery position. Standard procedure would be artillery bombardment followed by infantry assault. But ammunition was being conserved for operations that still mattered, and British commanders had learned there was a more efficient method. 4 Churchills approached at dawn, moving at walking pace through morning mist. No preliminary bombardment, no infantry screen, just 4 tanks and the promise of their presence. German defenders opened fire at 400 meters, Panzerfaust teams rushing to positions they had prepared weeks earlier. The first 2 rockets missed, the next 3 struck home. 1 penetration of side armor, 2 bounces from Glace's plates. The penetrated Churchill stopped, smoke pouring from the engine deck. Its turret continued traversing, the gun still functional, crew still inside. The remaining 3 Churchills continued forward. The German commander radioed for the 80mm gun they had been promised, received word it was destroyed yesterday, committed to another sector, in transit, the usual excuses that meant it was not coming. His men fired until they exhausted their Panzerfaust supply. They hit 2 more Churchills, disabling 1, sending the 3rd back with damaged tracks. The final Churchill reached the village edge alone, damaged, smoking, moving on emergency power, and the village surrendered, not to the single Churchill, to what it represented. The defenders could see reinforcements behind it, more Churchills waiting in reserve, British infantry preparing to advance. They had stopped 3 tanks, damaged a 4th, and accomplished exactly nothing. More would come. More would always come. The arithmetic of their situation was simple and fatal. When British infantry entered the village an hour later, they found the Volkssturm commander had ordered his men to stack weapons and wait. The officer stood beside the 1 intact Panzerfaust he had conserved, looking at the disabled Churchill 50 meters away. "We can kill it now," he told the British lieutenant through a translator, "but there will be another behind it, and another behind that. Why should more men die for arithmetic?" The village was taken without firing another shot. The Churchill, its mission complete, limped back for repairs. The Churchill fought until the war's final day, advancing toward Hamburg when Germany surrendered. Of all Allied tanks, it traveled the shortest distance in total, slow to the last, and saw the longest sustained combat. It outlasted the Tigers that were meant to destroy it, outlasted the defensive lines built to stop it, outlasted even the confidence of the men who first dismissed it as a desperate British improvisation. Military historians debate the Churchill's place in armor history. It was never the best tank on any battlefield, always too slow, always undergunned compared to its peers, always mechanically complex where simplicity would have served better. Yet it achieved what more elegant tanks could not. It made German defenders fear an opponent they could neither outmaneuver nor reliably kill. That fear, more than any tactical victory, represented the Churchill's true triumph. The Germans feared facing the Churchill not because it would destroy them quickly, but because it would not stop coming. In 3 years of combat across Tunisia, Italy, France, and Germany, Wehrmacht forces learned that you could hit the British tank, slow it down, even disable it, but you could not make it go away. Behind every destroyed Churchill came another, and behind that one, another still. The British had inadvertently created a weapon that embodied their national character: stubborn, tough, maddeningly persistent, and absolutely immune to the normal logic of when to quit. 79 years later, surviving Churchills sit in museums, their armor scarred by impacts that should have been fatal, their suspensions still capable of climbs that seem impossible to modern tankers. Veterans who faced them speak with grudging respect about the tank that wouldn't die. That simple phrase captures everything the Churchill represented. Not innovation or elegance, but something more fundamental. The refusal to be beaten expressed in riveted steel and determined crew work. The Churchill was slow, old-fashioned, and inadequate by every modern standard, but it won its war by surviving it, by outlasting everyone who bet against British engineering stubbornness, by teaching the Wehrmacht that some opponents cannot be defeated quickly, and that if you cannot defeat them quickly, you will eventually not defeat them at all. The tortoise beat the hare not through speed, but through the simple mathematical certainty of showing up every single day until the race was over.